This week on Brian Ross Investigates, sneak attack. A whistleblower lawsuit claims sales reps for a major health company were told to sneak into nursing homes, bring food for the staff, and pose as essential workers in order to recruit patients for the company's hospice care business.
These sales reps were being encouraged to find creative ways and sneaky ways to get themselves and their donuts or their pizzas or whatever into these facilities, not to deliver healthcare services, but to sell.
All at the very time the company's president was meeting with the White House COVID-19 task force.
It's a matter of life and death and endangering not only the patient's safety, but essential healthcare workers.
Plus, as the COVID-19 infection rate spikes across the country, what about those July 4th presidential spectacles? Few masks, little social distancing.
We are now doing unbelievably well and are in deep testing on vaccines, treatments, and therapeutics.
Should the Republicans stick with plans for a convention next month in hard-hit Florida? We're joined by Dr. William Schaffner. And this week's winners and losers in the media. The editor-in-chief of Mediaite shares his picks. See if you agree.
It's hard to watch these things because you get so bored.
From the Law and Crime Trial Network, this is Brian Ross Investigates. Good evening, and thank you for joining us, and welcome to our viewers on Facebook Live and YouTube Live. I'm joined tonight by my colleague at the Law and Crime Network, Rhonda Schwartz. And Rhonda, we begin with allegations of profits over people during the pandemic. A whistleblower lawsuit alleges a major company put the lives of nursing home residents and the staff at risk in order to sell their products. And as we know, Rhonda, that's a very vulnerable population.
That's right, Brian. We knew from the beginning that elderly folks were at greater risk from this virus. But the New York Times has actually gone ahead to try to quantify this by doing their own data study, collecting data from nursing homes and long-term care facilities state by state. And their analysis shows that as many as 43% of all U.S. deaths from the virus were elderly folks in these homes as well as staff. So it's a very large percentage at risk.
And yet, Rhonda, this lawsuit alleges that this major company urged its sales reps to sneak into nursing homes to sell. Headquartered in Miami, Florida, the VITAS healthcare company boasts in this promotional video that it has been a leader in providing hospice, end-of-life healthcare to patients in 14 states and the District of Columbia.
We have over 12,000 professionals with the expertise that comes from helping the thousands of people day and night who depend on us.
Christina Eisenacher of San Mateo, California, is a sales representative for VITAS. It's her job to go into hospitals and nursing homes and sell the company's hospice care to those in the final stages of life. Even, she says, in a lawsuit filed last month against VITAS during the pandemic. Her lawyer is Kay Van Way.
When the outbreak began escalating and various municipalities and states began enacting regulations, shutdown orders, work from home orders, Christina was alarmed that as a non-essential worker, a salesperson, basically, that her employer was asking her to willfully skirt the stay-at-home orders, and not only just skirt those orders, but go into facilities that were on lockdown for the residents' safety.
And Christina is not a nurse now. She's not a doctor. She's not a clinical person, right? She's a salesperson?
That's correct.
Given the high rates of infection and death, state and federal health officials put nursing homes on a strict lockdown. Even families were kept out. Only essential healthcare workers were allowed to enter.
As we manage this disease and the dynamic nature of this moment, we need to anticipate spread, but we also need to prioritize our focus. And the purpose of today's announcement is to focus on specifically what we mean by that. Most important thing, again, is to protect the most vulnerable, protect our seniors.
But Christina says she got this phone message from her company that she should call herself an essential worker and gain access to nursing homes.
All VITAS staff are considered essential healthcare workers. Report to work as scheduled. Governor's stay-at-home order does not apply. Carry your VITAS badge to identify yourself as a healthcare employee in the event that you require proof of employment.
There's also was encouragement from the very top for sales reps to show their successes. So if you are able to get into a lockdown facility, be sure and document it, snap your selfies, share them with the group so we can all cheer you on, and be sure and send those up the chain to corporate so that you can be featured in the newsletter.
According to the lawsuit, these are some of the photos her fellow sales reps posted, apparently bringing snacks and food for nursing home staff to help get them in.
Brian, there's no medical reason to be taking food into the facility, and I'd like to point out that this was not food for the residents. This was food for the doctors and nurses and healthcare administrators who could influence a referral.
And those pictures that we see that she has sent to us, tell us what we're seeing there. One of them says sneaky.
It's particularly troubling that they were bragging about the fact that they were willfully skirting the laws, and anyone who has a loved one in a nursing home knows darn good and well that they can't go visit their loved one, in many cases, even if their loved one is dying. And they can't take a dozen donuts to their loved one or even get into the facility. Yet these sales reps were being encouraged to find creative ways and sneaky ways to get themselves and their donuts or their pizzas or whatever into these facilities, not to deliver healthcare services, but to sell.
The president and CEO of VITAS Healthcare, Nick Westfall, declined our invitation to appear on the program and respond to the allegations in the lawsuit. Westfall was in Washington back in March to meet with Vice President Pence and the COVID-19 task force, where the need to protect nursing homes was prioritized.
Generally, we monitor our nursing homes for abuse and neglect, but at the president's direction, we're going to focus exclusively on ensuring that those who are in nursing homes, people operating the nursing homes, like many of the CEOs that we met with today, are complying with the new standards to keep our elderly safe.
The very standards the company has been violating, according to Christina Eisenacher's lawsuit. In a statement, Westfall thanked the Trump administration, saying, quote, "It was clear their top priority is to ensure healthcare providers receive the full support and resources necessary to deliver care when and however appropriate."
And it's disingenuous at best, in my opinion. Hypocritical is a term that comes to my mind, because what we have to remember is that VITAS is currently on probation. The federal government that is depositing $40 million every other week into their bank account also brought charges against them several years ago, accusing them of lying and cheating and stealing from the government, which, by the way, is you and me, the taxpayers. And VITAS agreed to pay, I believe it was $75 million fine, and refrain from behaving badly in the future. And yet here we are in the midst of a pandemic, and now the behavior that we complain of is not just a matter of cheating the taxpayers. It's a matter of life and death and endangering not only the patient's safety, but essential healthcare workers and the families of those healthcare workers, which translates to all of us, potentially.
Now, Christina Eisenacker's lawyer says she is facing retaliation for refusing to follow orders that she go into nursing homes posing as an essential healthcare worker. And what's been the impact on her to go through all this?
Well, Christina is under a tremendous amount of stress. She has stuck her neck out, so to speak. As everyone knows, jobs are hard to come by in this economy, and she has a good job. But as she said to me, no job, no paycheck is worth endangering so many people. And so she has stood up at her own risk because she says she wants to be able to look herself in the mirror in the morning, and she can't be a part of this for a paycheck or not. She just couldn't go along with the party line.
And as we said, VITAS executives declined to appear in our program. Rhonda Schwartz, have we heard anything at all from the company?
We've had no further response since we reached out to them for an interview last week, Brian. But one senior official from the company was quoted in the media as saying that their sales representatives, like Christina, were essential to providing hospice care. So therefore, they were deemed essential medical employees properly in their view.
Call them essential. All right. Well, coming up, those 4th of July celebrations, very presidential, but were they super spreaders of the COVID-19? We'll talk with Dr. William Schaffner after a break. You're watching the Law and Crime Trial Network. With the pandemic raging, President Trump has now made good on his threat to withdraw from the World Health Organization, filing formal papers today to pull the U.S. out of that organization. It all raises questions about the role or lack of it by President Trump in trying to stop the spread of the virus. To get more information on that, I talked this week with Dr. William Schaffner at Vanderbilt University, a leading expert on preventive medicine, and part of the group that's now looking to see if there's going to be an effective vaccine. Dr. Schaffner, thank you so much for being with us tonight. The headlines paint a very dire picture. The virus appears to be in control.
Yeah, Brian, it looks as though the virus is all over the United States, and in many states, I'd say the majority, it really is spreading. So we've fallen behind. The virus is out there spreading rather widely across the country at the present time. It's very sobering.
Indeed. This past July 4th, we saw President Trump speak first at Mount Rushmore and then at the White House. Very few masks were being worn, very little social distancing. And he said that 99% of the cases are harmless. Is that true?
99% of the cases are not harmless, I'm afraid. He's misinformed. It's clear that a substantial proportion of people have very little illness or no symptoms at all, but we still see any number of patients that come into the hospital, need oxygen. Some of them have to be put on ventilators. And so that's really serious disease. Obviously, hospitalizations are increasing in many parts of the country. Intensive care units are being stressed because of limited beds. And so I think we have to focus on the fact, not on the people who don't have very many symptoms, but on the people who do have serious symptoms. Furthermore, those people with few symptoms are spreaders. They're moving the virus around, and they will encounter people who have underlying illnesses or who are older. And it's those people who we see in our clinics and whom we have to admit to the hospital.
We see the pictures of young people at the beach, at bars, at restaurants. They are the spreaders, aren't they?
Yes, those young people who are being carefree rather than careful are the great disseminators now of this virus throughout our communities. And that's very unfortunate. We seem to have two populations: people who are older, who have underlying illnesses. They're sheltering at home, being very careful, wearing their masks, 6 foot distancing, having very careful conversations about whether they ought to meet with relatives. That's one group. And then we have a rather large group of people, young people, middle-aged people with families who have cabin fever and they wish to return to an old normal. They're out there being rather blithe, not wearing masks frequently, and certainly not observing 6 foot distancing, and going to large group events. That's exactly the sort of environment that the COVID virus likes. It likes to be transmitted when people are out there without masks and very close together.
Dr. Schaffner, is there a middle ground, given the push for reopening, between complete lockdown and the large gatherings we're seeing? Is there a middle ground?
Of course, there's a middle ground, Brian. We're not going to lock down again. The economic implications of that were just disastrous. So, what we have to do is find that middle ground. We have to look for the new normal, a new normal where wearing masks, weird and strange and a bit uncomfortable though it is the new normal. By the way, let me say very quickly, wearing masks is not a political statement. The COVID virus doesn't care whom you vote for or if you vote at all. It loves to be transmitted. So the mask is a public health device. It protects you, the wearer, and even more importantly, it protects the people around you. So wearing the mask. Another middle road is watch that 6 foot distancing. We're just going to have to be more separate from each other. And then as to group gatherings, yes, that also is discomforting because we can't go to a lot of these large group events that we used to enjoy. We're going to have to keep ourselves in smaller groupings. And quite frankly, this will go on for the next several months. Otherwise, this virus will continue to spread and make many, many people ill.
Dr. Schaffner, it must be distressing to you to see the politicization of this whole episode here. The pandemic becomes a political issue with people deciding to wear masks or not based on their political beliefs, and with the President of the United States putting out information that's just not true.
Well, having politics enter into this has, I think, everyone in public health and clinical infectious diseases just puzzled because the COVID virus itself is totally apolitical. And for it to have become a political event, or political issue, I should say, makes the introduction of public health interventions much more difficult because they become misunderstood. And so the notion clearly is that this virus spreads readily. We don't have a vaccine yet. So what is it that we can do to inhibit the spread of the virus? And those things are clear. It's the masking, the 6 foot distancing, the avoiding large groups. And being sensible about that doesn't mean you don't have to have fun. It doesn't mean you can't get together with friends and still have a good time, but you have to do it in a very careful and somewhat limited way.
Dr. Schaffner, let me ask you about the issue of vaccine. The president said over the weekend that it would be available very, very soon, well before the end of the year. You know a lot about this. Is that the case?
Well, we'll have to see how the vaccine trials go. I am very comforted by the fact that the Food and Drug Administration has released a whole list of guidelines, things that have to be met, criteria that have to be met before a vaccine is licensed. And they focus on two things. Those are the appropriate things. Does the vaccine work and how well does it work? That's effectiveness. And the other is safety. Have we had enough vaccine put into sufficient volunteers, a sufficient number of volunteers, so that we can reasonably assure the American population that we think this is a safe and reasonably effective product? And we can give them not only good assurance, but what this vaccine will do. We can anticipate how good it will be. Once we have that information from the trials, then we can go out with that vaccine.
Doctor, you've always stressed the importance of not overpromising and then under-delivering, but isn't that what the president seems to be doing?
We've had a lot of overpromising here. It's troublesome because then people anticipate kind of a quick answer. And I think there are no quick answers here. There may be speedy answers because everybody's working hard, but we shouldn't overpromise. It's better to underpromise and then overdeliver. Then that's like a Christmas present. Everybody's surprised.
And finally, this is occurring in an election year. The Republicans plan a convention in Jacksonville, Florida, a state that's being especially hard hit with the virus. Is that a good idea?
Well, that sounds like it gets an X, that is a wrong answer next to all of the things. It's unlikely to be a masked event. There probably won't be very much social distancing. In fact, there'll be a lot of social mixing. And of course, it's a large public gathering indoors, 0 for 3. I think that is most unwise.
Your recommendation then would be?
How about we have to adopt to the new normal, a virtual convention. Let's do that because we can still have the spirit of getting together and electing a new candidate, reaffirming a candidate, but you just don't do it in person. We're doing so much virtually now, we can certainly manage that. We have that sort of innovation and cleverness in America. We can do that.
All right. Dr. William Schaffner, thank you once again so much for being here and for your very thoughtful words on all of this.
Thanks, Brian. Good to be with you.
Coming up next, continued evidence of police misconduct and police brutality. We'll talk with a Black police chief whose organization seeks to be the conscience of law enforcement. After a break, you're watching the Law&Crime Trial Network. Despite all the calls for police reform across the country, Congress is now adjourned without passing any major legislation to reform the police. Amidst all this, calls for law and order and a wave of crime in major cities across the country this weekend, Rhonda Schwartz.
Yes, the challenge to law enforcement grew worse with a series of horrifying shootings around major cities around the country, in shopping malls, city streets, backyards, and worst of all, deaths. 6 children were killed, including a 6-year-old who was celebrating at a party in her grandmother's, just playing in her grandmother's backyard. A terrible escalating violence for law enforcement to cope with.
Indeed, quite the issue. And caught in the middle of all this, Black police chiefs who are hearing from both sides, from their fellow officers and from their community. I talked with a leader of a group that seeks to be the conscience for law enforcement. Chief Davis, thank you for joining us. You are the police chief in Hazel Crest, Illinois, the next year's incoming president of the Illinois Association of Police Chiefs, and a member of the board of the National Association of Black Law Enforcement Executives, which calls itself the conscience of law enforcement. I guess many people would say, does law enforcement have a conscience?
Well, that is one of the things that we hold law enforcement accountable for, is to have those difficult conversations that often members in our profession have not historically had or felt comfortable having.
And do you find pushback from other chiefs who are white?
I have seen pushback. Yes, absolutely. There is pushback from people that may or may not believe that there is actually anything wrong or that there needs to be any reform in law enforcement. So yes, that does exist.
And what is your reaction when you hear that? And what do you say to people who are just telling you to back off?
Well, we're not going to be silenced. Right is right. And, The thing is, the idea is to develop relationships, and in relationships with many of my counterparts, while sometimes they may not agree with some of my beliefs and some of my feelings, quite often I found that most of them will at least respect that. And those folks who are who they are, we're going to keep fighting the fight.
There's a lot of talk now about defunding the police. What's the position of your organization on that?
So what we believe, so you have to get a definition, I guess. And in our definition, it's our belief that most folks are asking that resources be put in other places to help our communities. And what's happened is there were so many social services that were defunded, and a lot of those challenges that those social services were addressing on a day-to-day basis fell upon the police. And so we are definitely in favor of resources being put into the community to help us deal with some of the challenges that we as law enforcement do the best that we can with, but there are better equipped professionals to deal with those things. But what happened is when a lot of those social services were defunded, and we started to have to deal more with those things, such as homelessness, substance abuse, and mental illness, we weren't given the funding that they were using previously with those social service efforts. So, we do the best that we can, but we are all for additional resources to help the community.
But what that does mean, doesn't it, is that there'll be fewer police officers on the street if there's less money for police. And this is a time with a wave of violence in some of America's major cities, including Chicago nearby.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, that's why this has got to be a collaborative effort. It's got to be the community and the police coming together to come up with solutions. Historically, law enforcement has decided how they're going to police communities without much input from those communities. And coming together, we can come up with meaningful efforts that will help us as a police department and as law enforcement to most effectively help our communities out while doing it in an appropriate way so that we're serving them and not just policing the entire community.
Policing is always political, but never more so than it is right now in the presidential election with President Trump calling for law and order. Do you feel any way that you're in line with him, that he's overstating the problems?
Well, the problems being in line with him from a solution standpoint, I don't know that we're in line with him from a solution standpoint. The law and order stance has been one of the things that's damaged the relationship between law enforcement and communities of color. If you look back at the history of law enforcement, started out slave catchers is how law enforcement started out in this country, and then it evolved as the civil rights era came into play. You'd see law enforcement were the people who were putting dogs on women and kids in their Sunday best. And when we got beyond the Jim Crow laws, then we started dealing with things, having to enforce Jim Crow laws. So that's just been the history of law enforcement with marginalized and specifically with the Black community. So that is entrenched in the culture of law enforcement and has damaged the relationship over the years. And we have to work to, I won't even say rebuild, I say build relationships with communities of color.
And do you find yourself personally torn between the law enforcement community and the Black community? They shouldn't necessarily be at odds, but it seems more and more they perhaps are.
So it does present its challenges, but for me, I look at it as opportunity because I bring a unique perspective as a Black chief, and first and foremost, as a Black man. The worst encounters that I've personally had with law enforcement, the two worst encounters that I had in my lifetime have both been when I was a police officer, and the officers knew I was a police officer. And in one instance, I was actually a police chief, and the person knew I was a police chief. So, there's work to be done from a cultural standpoint, and we have most of our officers are out there every day doing the best that they can with what they've got to try to keep communities safe. But from a leadership standpoint, we have to make sure that we're setting the tone properly so that we're effectively servicing our communities.
I'm intrigued by what you said. What happened in those two incidents where you were a police officer, a police chief?
Well, one, I was stopped on a traffic stop, and it was by an officer in a neighboring community who had a history of doing racist and just straight out racist things in the community. And he was allowed to stay with that department. And we had a major encounter, which could have ended up being a deadly encounter. Very could have ended up being a deadly encounter. The other one, my son was a victim in a crime in an area, in a community nearby, and we were just going to check on the status of his case. And one of the officers there came out and told me, "I know who you are. I don't care who you are. You don't tell us how to run our police department. Get out of here." And you know, and just dismissed me. And that guy ended up going to federal prison for civil rights violations. But there are people like that that exist, and they are allowed to exist in police departments. And those are the people that we're talking about when we're talking about the bad actors in law enforcement.
Your organization, the National Association of Black Law Enforcement Executives, has issued a 4-point guidelines. One of them is training for de-escalation. I want to ask you about what we saw recently on the news about the officer in Miami and Dade County, Florida, at the airport there, who absolutely took a swing on a woman who was having a disagreement with that. Apparently she had missed her flight, and he just hauled off and punched her right in the mouth, a real sucker punch. That's not de-escalation, is it?
No, absolutely. That's an assault. You know, that's somebody who just lost control. The officer lost control. You know, we're trained to deal with people in situations that are not good. That's what they call us. And we're supposed to be the professional in those situations. And that was just somebody who just totally lost it. And there's got to be consequences for actions like that.
You also would call on other officers to be obliged to interfere, to get in the way if somebody's using inappropriate violence, officers using inappropriate violence, as was the case with George Floyd. It's a nice idea, but are police officers really going to do that to one another?
Well, once again, I'll go back to that word, culture. That's where the culture has to be such that officers are comfortable in interceding. And one of the things to promote that is there's accountability for everybody, just like the officers that were there with George Floyd. All those guys ended up getting charged. Now, what ultimately will happen to all 4 of them, I don't know, but they're all held accountable. And when officers see that they're going to be accountable for omission just as much as commission, then they're going to have to think about instances like that where they may have turned the other cheek.
We know over the years about the so-called blue line, police protect one another. Are you really able to change that, you think?
So culture, you know, and I talked about the history. Culture is a hard nut to crack, and it's not something that's going to happen. I don't know that it'll happen in my career, but I think what we need to do is we plant those seeds for the growth of the cultural change. We come up with a strategic plan to change things culturally, and when we plant those seeds, we just have to wait. I just pray that I'm able to plant those seeds, and that oak tree is able to grow out of those seeds that are planted. So when my grandkids and my kids are my age, that they will see effective change in culture and law enforcement.
And finally, Chief, after all you've seen in the past few months on the streets of Minneapolis, Atlanta, Louisville, all over the country, Miami, do you ever just give up, full of despair, like there's really no hope here?
We can't give up. Can't give up. If you're truly about the change, you cannot give up. I've been fighting. I look at this as opportunity. I'm a glass half full guy, and I look at this as opportunity. I've been fighting this fight to try to educate my peers on the injustices that happen to Black people and how we as law enforcement leaders have to address these issues. And I try to educate my colleagues that don't necessarily look like me as to some of the things that I've personally been exposed to try to bring them into understanding so that they can have empathy. And so that that empathy can flow down to the people that we lead. And for me, we got to look at this as opportunity. And, you know, I believe that this perfect storm that God has put us in right now is opportunity for our country and for our profession to move forward.
Chief Mitchell Davis, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much.
Coming up next, this week's winners and losers in the media. See if you agree with the editors of Mediaite, what they have to say about the power couple at the White House, Katie and Steve Miller. After a break, you're watching the Law and Crime Trial Network. back now with this week's winners in the media and the losers as well, as chosen by the editors of Mediaite. We're joined by the editor-in-chief of Mediaite, Aidan McLaughlin. Mediaite, of course, like the Law and Crime Trial Network, part of the Dan Abrams media empire. And Aidan, your first winner this week was the NBC News team that broke a big story about Jeffrey Epstein. Let's take a look at the clip.
Ghislaine Maxwell, who, of course, as we've talked about, Stephanie, is somebody who has been a longtime confidant and friend of Jeffrey Epstein, and who a number of his victims say recruited them to be sexually abused and trafficked by Jeffrey Epstein. Charges and accusations she's always previously denied, has been arrested by the FBI and is going to be charged by federal prosecutors in Manhattan.
So they broke the arrest story, right, Aidan?
Yeah, so this has been one of the biggest stories of the past week. It was the arrest by the FBI of Ghislaine Maxwell, who is Jeffrey Epstein's longtime girlfriend, who has been under investigation by the FBI for some time now. Now, that major bombshell story, which I don't know about you, Brian, but I didn't see coming, was broke by NBC News New York, their team that covers investigations and the law. And they basically broke news that Ghislaine had been arrested by the FBI, and then shortly followed it up with a report on the charges, which stem back decades and involve Ghislaine Maxwell's basically grooming underage girls for sex with Jeffrey Epstein and herself. So there's 6 charges in that indictment. It's a huge story, piggybacking off the Jeffrey Epstein story that obviously had a sort of early end when he killed himself inside a Manhattan jail last year.
You're right. No one is better sourced inside of the FBI and NYPD than Jonathan Dinst and his team at NBC News in New York. Your first loser was the group from Fox at the show Outnumbered. Let's take a look at what they had to say.
It's hard to watch these things because you get so bored. You want to just watch the clips afterwards because it's so slow and he speaks so slow and there's so much stumbling. But I forced myself, and it was kind of amazing because it was, I mean, his eyes were kind of empty, and who is he supposed to call on next? I mean, did he have the questions ahead of time and he was sort of had an order of people? The gym was nearly empty when you saw the whole thing.
So they're taking shots at Joe Biden, right, Aidan?
Right. So put aside the fact that a news person is just basically calling a Joe Biden speech boring, as if, that they expect more entertainment value out of it. What you saw Melissa Francis, who's that Fox News host, do there, and she wasn't the only one on the panel guilty of this, is push this conspiracy theory that Joe Biden had somehow coordinated with the reporters at that event to screen their questions. And so that he was sort of reading off, they claim that he was sort of reading off the teleprompter the answers that were pre-written based on the reporters' questions. That got pushed by President Donald Trump as well. It's complete nonsense. There was a Fox News reporter at that Joe Biden presser. The Fox News reporter did not pass his questions to Joe Biden's team to screen before the press conference. So, President Donald Trump pushing that conspiracy theory is one thing. It was pretty disappointing to see the next day, after it had already been debunked, members of this Fox News panel push it as well. So that's why we made them losers that day.
And did they ever correct the record?
No, we went back and forth with Fox News Communications on this. They were basically claiming that they were just asking questions, and that it was just sort of they were floating, what might have happened at the presser. But it was such a silly question to ask, and one that was already debunked. So, the idea that there was a segment dedicated to that is sort of absurd.
Your next winner was, of all things, Newsmax TV. Let's look at this clip from Fox.
The gap between Biden leading and the president falling behind is a reflection of the polls basically also showing a disapproval of kind of the way the coronavirus has been handled. Now, the Electoral College could go a very different way, but it's hard for you to come up with the numbers that the president needs to win at the moment.
And so why are they winners, Newsmax?
Right. So President Donald Trump has frequently in the past couple of weeks expressed his disapproval with Fox News' weekend coverage. We know that Fox News is the president's favorite network, but he's often tuned in on the weekends and seen coverage that he finds, I guess, not praiseworthy enough of his administration. That happened again on Sunday. That segment you just watched was covering his poll numbers and him trailing behind Joe Biden up in the upcoming 2020 election. Now, he tweeted that afternoon and basically instructed his followers to stop watching Fox News and to start watching Newsmax and OAN, which are these two conservative news outlets and TV networks that are far more pro-Trump than Fox News, if you can believe that. The thing about Newsmax is they still have a pretty tiny audience compared to Fox News. They average about 20,000 viewers, whereas Fox News' viewers are in the millions. Nonetheless, getting a presidential tweet and a shout out, Newsmax was mentioned in President Donald Trump's tweet. That's got to send some attention their way, and they got a good deal of news coverage out of it as well. So it was a win for the network.
He has praised them before. Is it making any difference to their bottom line or to their ratings?
Recently, he's praised OAN, One American News Network, a lot more than Newsmax. This is the first time he's praised Newsmax in a while, which is interesting because we know he's very good friends with Chris Ruddy, who runs Newsmax. It's unclear whether or not that has directed actually any viewers towards the network. I think we'd have to wait till the end of this week to see whether or not their ratings go up to any extent because he shouted them out on Sunday. So we're going to be looking at that too and just tracking to see if they get any sort of boost from this.
And I assume Newsmax is glad to have the presidential seal of approval.
Yeah, I think it's something that's coveted by OAN a lot. I'm sure Newsmax is also excited to have the shout out from President Donald Trump. They just hired Sean Spicer to host his own show on the network. So, they're clearly trying to make inroads with the president and at least his base. So, it seems to be working at least to some extent.
And today's big loser was the White House power couple, Katie and Steve Miller. Let's take a clip. I'll take a look at the clip from NBC News about them.
Katie Miller told Jacob Soboroff, quote, "My family and colleagues told me that when I have kids, I'll think about the separations differently. But I don't think so. Homeland Security sent me to the border to see the separations for myself, to try to make me more compassionate. But it didn't work," end quote. Jacob responds, quote, "It didn't work? I will never forget what I saw. Seriously. Are you a white nationalist?" he asked, exasperated. "No," she said, "but I believe if you come to America, you should assimilate. Why do we need to have, like, Little Havana?"
So Rachel Maddow there explaining the quotations from Katie Miller. Why are they such a power couple, and why are they losers?
Yeah, so basically that was Jacob Soboroff, an NBC News reporter, has an upcoming book about the family separation at the U.S.-Mexico border. And, Rachel Maddow was interviewing Jacob Soboroff about that book, and he actually got quotes from Katie Miller, who is, it's rare that we actually hear public comments from her. She's Vice President Mike Pence's communications director, and she's fairly behind-the-scenes presence at the White House. She really got popular last year when it was revealed that she was marrying Stephen Miller, who is a much more popular or at least famous figure in the White House as President Donald Trump's top advisor. He's basically takes much of the credit for President Donald Trump's right-wing immigration policies. So when it was revealed that she was marrying Stephen Miller, she became sort of a well-known figure, not just within D.C. Now, I haven't heard, a single interview with her since she became well-known, and these are sort of the first comments that I've seen. It kind of, reading them, it kind of makes sense as to why her and Stephen Miller are so aligned on these issues. But it was a pretty disturbing quote. She says that she went down to the border to see the detention facilities and felt no compassion. She also has a sort of odd comment about why the United States needs a Little Havana, which is sort of a historically challenged comment to make, given that every other American city is named after a city abroad. So it was a weird comment from her, weird quote, and it got thoroughly panned on social media.
All right, Aidan McLaughlin, thank you so much for joining us, and thanks to all of you for watching, and thanks to the staff at Law and Crime for getting us on the air and off the air.